So you've decided you want to buy a Sony camera, but there's just so many to choose from now and you're just really not sure where to start or which one you should buy. In today's video, I'm going to try my best to answer that question for you. I've really been loving this camper van. I can make videos anywhere in comfort and no one even knows I'm here. I'm literally sitting in a car park at a beach right now in the rain and no one would know I'm filming a video right now. I've spent a lot of time refurbishing it lately, so I'm going to do another walk around soon, but really the only thing I've kept in here from the previous owner is this mug. So I get asked two questions more than anything else on social media, or you guys messaging me through Instagram or whatever. The first one is, your presets are amazing, where can I buy them? Not really, but you can buy them, the link's in the description. And the second one is, which camera should I buy? I'm looking at the A7R4 or the A9 Mark II, or I'm looking at the A7 III or the A7C. Maybe I'm just, I get a lot of questions about which camera they should buy, and they're usually looking at two options. And like I said in today's video, I'm really just going to try and clear that up for you as quickly and as concisely as possible, covering all the main points. There is going to be a few things that aren't going to be mentioned, but these are the main things that will affect your day-to-day use of these cameras. So firstly, I'm only talking about the full frame series of cameras in this video. If you guys are interested in a video on the A6000 series or maybe anything else you want me to compare, let me know in the comments below. I'm also leaving out the A7S III for the most part. I am commenting on the end, but it's mostly a video camera. I haven't owned it personally, and the only other one I haven't owned is the A1, but I have used it for a bunch of weddings and I have a really solid opinion about who it's for and what it's best at. So otherwise, I've owned all of the cameras we're going to talk about for an extended period of time. I've shot them professionally and I have a really good real-world opinion on these cameras and who they might be good for. Secondly, all the cameras I'm including in today's video are all solid options. I would be totally happy with a second shooter or something using any of them. It really comes down to the shooter themselves. I'm going to break this into sections based off how close the cameras are priced together. So in the first one, we're talking about the A7C versus the A7 Mark III. So in reality, they're pretty much the same camera, but the A7C obviously shares this similar body to the A6000 series of cameras. Only the A7C is obviously full frame, and it has pretty much the same sensor as the A7 Mark III, so you can expect about the same image quality performance. The other difference is the A7C has a different focus system, so it has the more current focus system in the newer cameras, so it has real-time tracking and all that. However, the A7 III shares the full body of this A7R III and the A9 Mark I. So it's a full-size camera, where the A7C obviously shares a similar body to the A6000 series of cameras. The A7C is pretty uncomfortable for me to hold, but I own it personally because I film all of my YouTube videos on, and it's really changed how I make YouTube videos. I really love it for video. It's just a really easy camera to set up and shoot, and I can use it anywhere. For video, it can do pretty much everything the A7 III can do, but it has a better focus system and a flip-out screen. The A7C's viewfinder is pretty unpleasant to use for me personally, but I usually do wear glasses when I'm shooting, and it's just a little bit small. It's not going to be an issue for most people, but it is much smaller than the A7 III's viewfinder. If you don't really intend on doing any video where you're filming yourself, where you don't need a 30-minute record limit, because the A7C doesn't have a record limit, which is great for ceremonies and stuff like that if you're videoing. But if you're intending on mostly doing photo, I would probably suggest go with the A7 III. The only real benefit in terms of photo over the A7C is it does have real-time tracking, so it may be better for wildlife or sports or something like that. The A7 III obviously still has the same eye tracking focus that all the other recent Sony cameras have, so it's still a fantastic focus system. So in short, between these two cameras, photo pretty much equals A7 III, video pretty much equals A7C. They can both do both really well. It just really comes down to the extra features the A7C has and the larger body of the A7 III. Now, why would you choose the A7R III over the A7 Mark III? It is a little bit more expensive, but it does have some benefits. Firstly, the A7R III has a stronger body and it definitely has a much more robust shutter mechanism. So the A7R III is rated to 500,000 clicks, where the A7 Mark III is rated to 250,000 clicks. I never had an issue with my A7 III, the shutter breaking or anything, or my A7R IIIs. In fact, I've never had a shutter go in any of my Sony cameras over the 5 years I've been shooting Sony. But I do know personally people that have had the A7 Mark III shutter break. It's obviously covered under warranty most of the time. In reality, I don't think most people are going to have an issue with the A7 III shutter. It's just you hear about it online because typically when something breaks, people talk about it online. The A7R III has a much better rear LCD screen and a slightly better viewfinder. It's not that the A7R III rear LCD is amazing, but the A7 Mark III LCD screen is quite bad, and for me personally it was quite a distracting feature and one of the main reasons why I upgraded to the A7R IIIs in the first place. The focus systems on the A7R III and the A7 III are basically the same. The A7 III goes further out to the edge of the frame, but in a real world situation it hasn't really translated to any real benefit for me personally, and I have shot them side by side. Obviously the A7R III has a 42 megapixel sensor which is backlit, so it's still pretty good in low light. The A7 III is slightly better. Definitely you can notice it, but I'm still pretty impressed with how the A7R III handles itself in high ISO situations. The file sizes out of the 42 megapixel sensor are fine. I think any camera, any like MacBook for example, in the last 5 years is going to be fine handling it. I don't think you're going to notice any issues with the computer slowing down because of the file sizes. So if you were to ask me personally, and these were your two options, I would usually suggest going for the A7R III and just spending a few $100 more, if it's even possible, to get a few extra features to fix what the A7 III had and just get a bit of a stronger camera. It's starting to rain pretty heavy. I hope you guys can hear me. Now the A7R IV and the Sony A9, they're pretty much the same price wherever you look around the world at the moment. For me it's a no-brainer, but I'm a wedding photographer, not a sports shooter or a wildlife photographer, but that's not the only reason, so let's get into that now. For a start, the A9 Mark I has the same body as the A7 III and the A7R III, where the A7R IV has a much deeper, much larger grip, and it's much more comfortable for me personally with my giant lumberjack hands. But you can make the A9 much more comfortable with a grip. Same goes for the A7R IV. It's just with the A9 you really have to have a grip. With the A7R IV, if you had kind of normal size hands or smaller hands, even some people with larger hands, I don't think it's going to be an issue. But I always recommend a grip with any of the Sony cameras, like the Mickey one I have on my A9 Mark II. The A7R IV's viewfinder is one of the best Sony has at the moment, other than the A1, which is just amazing, and I think it shares the same viewfinder as the A7S III. The LCD screen is also a little bit better on the R4 than it is on the A9. The A7R IV also has 2 UHS 2 memory card slots, so that means you can write up to, I think the fastest memory cards you can get a 300 megabit a second write, which are the Sony Tough cards I'm using. Now the Sony A9 only has 1 UHS 2 slot, so what that means is if you're shooting raw to both cards on the A9, the fast slot is kind of pointless because you're just bottlenecked by that UHS 1 slot and slot 2. Now in a real world situation I definitely notice it. Even with the larger file sizes, the A7R IV with the 300 megabyte cards does write faster than the A9 with its smaller files when you're using the fastest cards you can get. The A7R IV has a much quieter mechanical shutter, where the Sony A9 has a really strangely loud, oddly sounding shutter, but it doesn't really matter because with the A9 it has the stacked sensor and you can use electronic shutter anytime without worrying about banding or warping, other than using flash where you have to switch to mechanical shutter. But the A9 sounds really bad. If you had to use mechanical shutter on the A9, I don't think I could use it. It's just so loud. With the A7R IV and any of the other cameras, you can shoot silent shooting, but you do have to worry about banding and warping for fast moving subjects. So it's just something to note, and I would definitely be careful shooting with the electronic shutter on anything other than A9 or the A1, just because it's a little bit dangerous. Trust me. Obviously the A9 can do 20 frames per second with no blackout, which is fantastic, especially if you're a sports or wildlife shooter, which I'm not. But the A7R IV can do 10 frames a second mechanical, and for me personally that's more than enough. I hardly ever use it. Really the only times I use 10 frames a second is if we're doing a bottle champagne spray or the couple of walking back up the aisle with confetti. The A9, thanks to its firmware update, does have real-time tracking, same with the A7R IV, so they both have the really amazing real-time tracking system, but the A9 probably has a very slight performance increase in low-light focusing situations. However, in a real-world situation, I have shot them side by side at plenty of weddings, and it doesn't really translate to any super benefit. It's not like you would really miss the A9 if you only had the A7R IV. They both focus really, really well. And lastly, the A7R IV obviously has a huge 62 megapixel full frame sensor, which creates really impressive files, but they are large and there is no small RAW option. I used to shoot compressed RAW, which I would definitely suggest doing because it cuts the files in half. They're just so big in uncompressed RAW. Where the Sony A9 has the 24 megapixel sensor, which is definitely better in low light as well. So that's something to weigh up whether you want really high resolution, maybe you're a landscape photographer, or you're shooting events and portraits, maybe the A9 would be better for you. The other downside of the A9, only for some people, but it doesn't have any picture profiles, so there's no S-Log or Cine 4 or anything like that for video users. It was a bit of an issue for me, but overall I don't think it's going to be an issue for most people. So for me personally, I would always go with the A7R IV. That's just how I feel about it. The A9 is still a fantastic camera. Maybe if you want to do wildlife photography and you want that 20 frames a second with the slightly improved autofocus, and you want to shoot it at high ISO, then probably go for the A9. Now, to make it easier with the A9 Mark II, you're paying around $1,000 to $1,500 more than the A7R IV. If you imagine the A7R IV and the A9 Mark II met in a bar somewhere and they smashed it, and then 9 months later they had a baby, it would be the A9 Mark II. The A9 Mark II has all of the good bits of the A9 and most of the good bits of the A7R IV, but with better low light performance and slightly better autofocus again over both of those previous cameras. The A9 II has the stack sensor, so you can use silent shooting, same as the A9 in any situation without compromise. It has the same focus system as the A7R IV, but again it's slightly better and it's a little bit better than the A9. I definitely notice it. Again, it's not a huge improvement. I'm totally happy with how the A7R IV focuses, but I had noticed after a certain amount of time that in low light situations the A9 II does lock on and hold the subjects a little bit better in dark situations. They both have UHS 2 card slots in both slots, which is really great. You would think that the A7R IV would take a little bit longer to write, having such a larger file size, but in a real world situation, again, I mean, I always say real world, but that's what we're talking about here. It doesn't really matter what's on the paper if it doesn't translate to real world situations. I find that they both write about the same. I'm not sure why that is, but yeah, I don't really have any issues with either of them, and it doesn't translate when you're shooting to hybrid. Say if I burst a few photos off on the A9 and the A7R IV, I still have to wait the same kind of few seconds to press record on either of them for video, so it doesn't really make that much of a difference. Now, for those of you that have been following my channel for a while, you know that I was shooting with two A7R IVs for most of the wedding season and half of the previous wedding season, and then I switched to the A9 Mark IIs for no real other reason other than to try them out and really put them through its paces in a long-term situation, so I could give you guys my thoughts on it. And I can tell you, I don't regret switching to the A9 IIs. They're great. I don't have no plans on changing them because I can't afford the A1, which we'll talk about in a second. But if I had to go back for whatever reason to the A7R IVs, I wouldn't be disappointed either. They're both fantastic cameras, and it really comes down to each individual feature, whether you want the faster shutter, no blackout, better autofocus, better low light, or you want really impressive high resolution images and a better viewfinder. You know, there's advantages to each camera, so it really comes down to your personal preference. I will say that 24 megapixels is plenty. No one needs 62 megapixels. I'm going to put it out there and just say it. That's my opinion. But 62 is really, really impressive, but I definitely don't think it's necessary. Now, the A1. Let me try and make this really, really clear. The A1 is a result of a massive orgy between all of the Sony cameras. It has all of the good bits from all of them, none of the bad bits, and some extra good features that are new to it, and it's just the most impressive camera I've ever used. There's really no reason not to buy the Sony A1, other than for the same price you could probably buy two Mazda Miatas, paint them purple, put turbos on them, and cruise around with your mate with your hair or hands in the wind and have a great time. So, life choices. And finally, the A7S III. Now, we all know it's mostly a video camera. It can take photos. They're only 12 megapixels, and that might be right for a lot of stuff, especially social media and whatever, but You know, for weddings, I don't know, maybe not, but it is a great camera, and I will do a better review on it once I've really put it through its paces. And that's pretty much it. I hope that helped you guys out. If it didn't, I'm sorry it made it worse, but maybe go through the timestamps and check all the individual features I've been talking about each camera. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. It's more down to you. I would just suggest picking up one of them and then refining your skills and learning how to market yourself to start making money if that's something you want to do. So thanks for watching, guys. Like, subscribe, comment, you know, all that stuff, bell, and I'll see you in the next video.